Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. We recorded the episode today via a live video link during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, just to forewarn you that occasional interruptions to the internet connection occur, and you may detect some minor disruption in the recording quality. We apologize in advance and hope that you enjoy the conversation we captured. Thank you. Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises for our play today in the autumn of 2015 on the nicely appointed open-plan living room and kitchen of a flat in Crouch End, London. It is the early hours of the morning, and the room contains the detritus of a housewarming party in the flat that has just wound down. The hostess, Laura, who is 38, is standing looking at the one remaining guest from the party, Danny. Danny is a friend of a friend who was an invited guest at the party, but somehow he finds himself the last one here. He is 42, dressed in a smart shirt and trousers, as if he came to the party after work, although he has a big ketchup stain on his shirt. He is a bit nervous. This is the beginning of David Eldridge's play, Beginning, which was first produced in the Dorfman Theatre at the National Theatre in October 2017, before it transferred to the Ambassadors in the West End in January 2018. Justine Mitchell as Laura and Sam Troughton as Danny rightly received critical acclaim for their performances, as did the play. My seeing Beginning was one of the most piercingly engaging experiences I've had in the theatre in recent years. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome none other than its author, David Eldridge, joining me on the podcast today via video link. Welcome, David.
Hi, how you doing? All right.
I'm good, thanks. Now I must do a proper introduction. David Eldridge is widely regarded as one of the most prominent playwriting voices at work today. His plays include Under the Blue Sky, which premiered at the Royal Court in 2000 and was revived in the West End in 2008. His play Festin, an adaptation of the film of the same name that premiered at the Almeida in 2005 before transferring to the West End and Broadway. He has also often written about Essex, where he originally comes from, in plays such as M.A.D. from 2004 and Market Boy in 2006, which are partly informed by his childhood working on a stall at Romford Market, as well as In Basildon, which premiered at the Royal Court in 2012. One of my favorites is The Knot of the Heart, which was produced by the Almeida in 2011 and powerfully displays the terrible price of addiction on a family. David has also successfully adapted classics from Ibsen and Strindberg, including The Wild Duck, John Gabriel Borkman, and Miss Julie. He's also written for TV, including the screenplay for The Scandalous Lady W on BBC, and he lends the experience and expertise he has gained in his impressive career as a lecturer in creative writing at Birkbeck University of London and in teaching screenwriting for the Argonne Foundation. Before we launch into our conversation about the play, David, I'm going to ask if I may prevail on your patience for a minute more, because for the benefit of listeners who haven't had a chance to see or read the play, I think it might be helpful to give them a brief summary of the scenario that we are watching. I described the opening and the two characters, Laura and Danny, who are left alone at the end of Laura's housewarming party. We learn pretty early on that although Laura and Danny don't actually know each other, they both had their eye on each other from afar during the party. Laura declares that she knew Danny was eyeing her up and states straight out that she fancies him and that she wants him to stay. It is safe to say that her forwardness rather freaks Danny out, who lacks confidence to the extent that he spends much of the time they spend together over the course of the play finding ways not to have sex with Laura. The play is entirely about the to and fro between these two characters, enacted in real time as they feel each other out and navigate toward whether they will sleep together or not. Okay, so that's the setup. My first question, David, is where did your idea for the play come from? I know that's a classic. Where do your ideas come from? I mean, for this play, is it based on people you know or events that happened to them?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it comes from a sort of a funny story that happened to a mate of mine. But like years and years ago, when we were in our kind of probably our early 20s or mid 20s, I mean, I even forget now, where basically he went to, it's a very similar situation playing as in that he went to a house party. He didn't realise that the girl whose flat it was liked him. And at the end of the night, he sort of was going to go and get in a taxi home with the rest of our friends. And then one of our mates said to him, no, you've got to stay. And then at that point, penny dropped a little bit. And then the following day, like the group of sort of lads that I was friends with, I mean, I actually hadn't been, I wasn't there at this party, by the way. So all I heard is this stuck in hand because it was a funny story. And then the following day, we'd met on a Saturday afternoon, like a bunch of lads in their mid-20s. And this guy hadn't yet turned up because, he'd stayed at this woman's place, we assumed, that night. And, but eventually he appeared and, there was a lot of kind of piss-taking and joking and that about what had happened and that. And he was... just sort of going, oh, fuck off, and wasn't really close to say anything. And then eventually all he said was that it was really awkward and that he helped her do some tidying up and it was really awkward and that eventually they'd opened a bottle of wine and had a shag on the sofa. And I just sort of thought it was a really good idea for a play, that situation. It was kind of there. And I think things stayed that way for what must have been maybe 10 years, maybe more than that. It was around 2005. I remember starting to think that I really would like to do a play that was very naturalistic and maybe didn't have much dialogue. And also around that time, my ex-wife and I had one of her friends to stay. And I remember on this Saturday night after the three of us had been out, my ex-wife went to bed and I was left up late with this guy who was a school friend of hers, and we had some whiskey and he got a bit maudlin and I couldn't really get to the bottom of what he was being maudlin about really, apart from the fact that he was drunk. And then eventually he said that he was poorly maintained in the area of the groin. And I was like Laura in the play, I had no idea what he was talking about. And I didn't know, whether he had some sort of problem, getting an erection, or whether he had an STD, or I didn't know what he was talking about. And then it sort of dawned on me that all he was saying was that he just, that he just couldn't get a shag, that he was single and he was fed up being single and he couldn't get a shag. And I remembered somehow that I joined this up with this other funny story that had happened to my mate years and years earlier. And at that time, when I sort of tend to develop an idea for a play a bit further, I tend to buy myself a box file. And then as I get ideas as I go along, or I read things, they tend to get written down on bits of paper and stuffed in this box file. And sometimes you have these box files that go on for ages, for years, and they have bits of paper and ideas and notes and bits of notebooks and all sorts. And sometimes they turn into something and sometimes they don't. They just go on and on and on,
Mm-hmm.
But I remember with this one, I wrote on the side of it, like the acronym of poorly maintained in the area of the groin. So what is it? PMITATG on the side of it. And whenever I got ideas for this play, I just would sort of put them in this box file. And that was probably around 2005.
That's a long time ago. This has taken a long gestation period.
Yeah, it's the most gestated play, I think, that I've had. But I always had this thought, I must write that play one day, These two sort of funny stories. Also, I liked the idea of doing something that was very naturalistic and maybe was quite spare on the dialogue or didn't have much dialogue. Like, I love the work of the kind of quite naturalistic and social realist German playwright Franz Xaver-Croitz. But those plays don't, they're a bit short on levity, aren't they? There aren't too many jokes in them, And so I love the idea of doing something that was as rigorous in its naturalism and commitment to naturalism as some of that German theatre. But equally, I like the idea of doing something that was from a seam of the English theatre, Particularly the comedy that comes out of awkwardness, scrupulously observed. I think it was in 2015, autumn 2015, when the play's set, I was meant to be working on this TV job, and it went tits up for one reason or another. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to try and write that play.
You got the box file out?
Well, I did the box file out. That was the funny thing about it, really. I didn't get it out. I don't think I even knew where it was.
Oh, wow, after all that.
Yeah, but I think that all of that stuff had stuck.
Yes, it was in there.
Yeah, and of course what had happened as well over all those years that this idea was gestating was that the characters were getting older as I was getting older.
Yes.
And, what I realised, I suppose, when the characters are sort of knocking 40, is there seemed a lot more at stake for the characters then.
Yes. So I'm fascinated that it all started from such small things, and it then took all this time to brew in your mind. And of course, as you say, your perspective changes as well, and the characters who originally may have been in their 20s are now in their late 30s. I saw a film once where Arthur Miller famously said that he wrote down on a card a single line stating what his play was about and pinned it on the wall in front of him to help him keep everything he wrote heading in that direction. Now, I don't mean to be reductive, and perhaps you don't work that way, of course, but and nor does it have to be about one thing. But when you came to it, what did you think the play was going to be about? Did you have an intention about what it was wanting to say?
I think I did, yeah. I maybe wouldn't. I don't do that thing in the way that Arthur Miller does, because I think I'm quite fearful of manipulating the characters much along the course of what the theme of the play is. I sort of, in a way, want the philosophy of the play and the worldview of the play to come from the characters and their actions. But having said that, I did have a sense of kind of what I wanted it to explore a bit, in that I certainly initially it was really about this idea of whether progress was possible in some way.
In someone's life, you mean?
Yeah. And I thought that it was really interesting because I think that it was a really challenging time that time for people like me of a kind of a liberal left persuasion when you're seeing Brexit happen and Trump happen. So in the kind of macro world, for someone like me, there's a kind of sense of is a kind of progressive, literal progress possible, And then, but I was interested in that for the purposes of beginning, in the whether progress is possible or not within someone's life as they are.
Yes.
And I think both Danny and Laura feel that they've reached points where they're wondering about whether progress is possible.
Well, of course, especially because, it hasn't really been all that successful or turned out the way they might have imagined, which is something that happens to a lot of us.
Yeah.
And particularly that time of life in your late 30s, you go, the promise of youth and the ideas about how your relationships are going to last for a lifetime and all that kind of thing is not necessarily the way it turns out.
Sure, that's right. There is one thing that's relevant to me from Arthur Miller, and this is in Beginning, and I think this is in Basildon to a certain extent, and this is in The Knot of the Heart to a certain extent. And Miller does this in his plays as well, which is that it's always incredibly powerful in the theatre and moving when a character is able to find a way of articulating what their dream is. When someone is able to say, this is what I really want, this is what my hopes are, or this is what my hopes were, because they might be articulating a dream that's already been dashed.
Yes. These are the most profound things within us, aren't they, really?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are moments in Beginning, it's most clearly articulated by Laura, I think, who, in a very moving but also sort of ironic, sort of laughing at herself a little bit way, articulates all of her dreams and fantasies, quite clearly. But Danny does too, but he does it in like one line, which is, I always wanted to be a family man.
Yes.
So I think that's that's something that I owe to Miller, I'd say.
Well, the play definitely does that for these characters in a sort of gradual way. You learn more and more as they get to know each other, or they open up to each other about what their real hopes and dreams and disappointments have been. I was going to ask you about time. You very specifically say in the introduction that it's set in autumn 2015, and in the play there are references to Jeremy Corbyn, and Laura even says America is going to elect a woman president for the first time in its history. The play premiered in 2017, so this was already history. So what was your intention being so specific about that time? Won't such references pass into obscurity, or why would you say this is when it's set?
Well, because it's really important, because the thing about this play was that I wanted the audience to wonder what had become of Danny and Laura. I don't make many claims for my plays because I think it's a stupid thing to do. But I do think this is true, because so many people said it. And not, audience members, people that comment on social media, it came up again and again and again. And that was that at the end of the play, audiences, I've never had this so much with play, audiences wanted to know whether Danny and Laura had stayed together. And I would never answer the question because it's a stupid question in one sense, because it's not within the remit of the play, but it's also a brilliant question because it's what the play asked people to do, which is to wonder what had become of the characters in that period. That's why it is like it is. And the thing about Hillary Clinton was very deliberate, because for me, it's not certain that Danny and Laura are together forever. They could be. They could have just had a great night and never seen each other again after all of that. That kind of stuff happens in life.
So I think it sets it what you're saying is it sets it in a sense of time passing, both in the world and in these people's lives. And therefore, it's what real life is. It is just time moves on. And I think actually the thing about Hillary Clinton, of course, is it also fills us with a deep melancholy now because, Laura's hope, she says the whole world will know things have moved forward for women, for everyone. It's going to be great when Hillary wins. And we know it's going in the other direction. And how tragic is that? And that these things, the future cannot be forecast in that way. There isn't, as you said earlier, automatic progress.
No. So, and also, in terms of how time is used in the play itself, I wanted to kind of make a piece of theatre in a very pure sense, which is that I think in a way what kind of defines dramatic writing for the theatre as opposed to for film or TV or for radio is, of course, that it's for live performance. And for me, what that means is that you have to try and create something that can exist on the moment and in the present tense, not just as a technical exercise for the actors to have a script that's performable, but also you have to have something that can exist in the present tense for an audience as well. I really like the idea that a really naturalistic piece of theatre would sort of overcome the fourth wall actually in its own way, despite its complete respect for it, because you want the audience to be so with the characters moment to moment,
Yes, exactly.
So that we are all in it together for all of that hour and 40 minutes, So time was very important in that way too.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right, because the play is, as you say, an hour and 40 minutes, and you specify no interval, and it runs straight through in real time. And I think you're absolutely right. It creates this sense of it being real, a quality of being in the moment. We're living every moment between these characters as they're living it. So it has that immediacy. Actually, I read that somewhere that you said that, as you said just now, the play text is a blueprint for dramatic action, a manual almost for putting things in motion, right? And creating momentum. And you quoted, I believe, Edwardian playwright Harley Granville Barker saying that to ensure that there is enough drama to keep the momentum going, something needs to happen every 10 minutes. I know that there can be a wide range of definitions of what something happening consists of, but given that this is an unfolding in real time, but did you have a sense of a structure of what would happen in that period of real time that you therefore built the play around? And if so, what sort of things did you identify as what were the yardsticks in this?
Well, I didn't. Well, there's two things there. I mean, firstly, that I remember that hearing that thing about from Granville Barker in a lecture when I was at university, and thinking that it was ridiculous because, and even as a 20-year-old, didn't know his arse from his elbow. That actually a play where something happens every 10 minutes is quite a boring play, and that much more needs to happen in a play than that for it to be compelling and interesting. And actually, but if you look at Chekhov, for example, those don't have massive events like a murder. They can be little things that are happening every page, or two or three things on a page, rather than being every sort of 10 minutes. And I've always thought attention span of modern audience is much more like that of an ad break or a pop song. And so I tend to sort of think that things need to happen at least every 2 or 3 minutes. And actually what you need to have in the theatre in terms of that thing that I was talking about earlier about creating something that can exist in the present tense for everyone, it has to have a sense of elasticity. Now, having said that, in beginning other plays, I do have a clear sense of shape and structure before I begin, but maybe not every 2 or 3 minute beat worked out in the way that I would in a telly, you know? And with beginning, because it was so important for it to feel real, and I never ever wanted it to feel kind of like they could see the cogs turning in any way, I just knew that there were the kind of these big moments that I was working towards, and that along the way, that I would have to keep things interesting in a way. And I also had confidence. What gave me confidence was that I knew that I had a very compelling situation, which is that two people who like each other, you know, when two people like each other and they address it, normally that means that they can kiss. But what happens in beginning, because Danny's not confident, is that by kind of exposing the elephant in the room, the elephant then becomes a massive obstacle to them actually kissing, which is something the audience got that dilemma and were interested in that dilemma, and it bought me an hour and 40 to go in all sorts of directions. People just wanted to know if it was going to work out for them, and I also knew that I had a really good, you know, in terms of the big moments in it, I kind of knew I kind of had like an act 2 reversal when Laura told Danny that she was ovulating, but actually, you know, there was a part of her that wanted to get pregnant, and I knew that I had a midpoint in terms of Laura. After they dance and they still don't kiss, Laura says maybe you should just go home, you know, and they have a little bit of an argument. So I knew that I kind of had a superstructure that was really secure, and in a way I trusted it. I just had to trust that and then work page to page almost in quite an incremental way and trust myself and the characters so that it felt completely natural and real.
Yes, because there's got to be a combination between your plan and that framework, but also what's real for the characters.
Yeah.
You have an idea for the arc of the story, but it's not convincing drama if it does not come naturally from the behavior of the characters, and that the characters are credible and consistent.
Of course.
And of course, the whole play is basically about these characters. So, I guess I want to ask you next is where they came from and how do you develop Danny and Laura? Do you build up an extensive background for each character? What were the keys for you that defined who they were?
Well, the first thing to say is I don't really tend to do any of that character building stuff. It doesn't really help me write the play. All that character is a sum of what a character does, what a character says.
Yeah.
And sometimes what other characters say about them, not in their when they're in the room, which doesn't apply to beginning actually, because they're both always in the room, which may give you a different perspective on a character, you know. So that's all character is to me. So I've found, although it helps some writers, it's never helped me to do these kind of big character biographies. Now I will do some character work in the sense that if there's particular stuff about a job a character does, or the world that they're from, or their family background, or relationship background, then I maybe will do a bit of some of that work so I kind of know what that is before I write the play. But I tend to reveal the character through action, which is what I think that you're supposed to do in a drama anyway, you know, and it's what's most interesting. You want to reveal a character through their actions rather than explain a character to an audience. In my plays, the characters are almost always composites of different things. I mean, in Danny, I think Danny is a mixture of me, is a mixture of those two different guys that I talked to you about earlier. There was a guy that I met in 2013 who had not seen his daughters in 3 years, who was peeled raw. But if I may, can I just talk a bit more about Laura actually as well? Because mainly I think Laura was informed by different women that I met actually after I'd split up with my wife and I was trying dating. I'd not been single since I was 24. And so to start dating again was a whole new experience, let alone dating in an era of websites and apps and all of that. And I suppose two things really struck me, which was that I had this quite naive idea that it was all going to be about promiscuity and actually what I found, which I didn't mind at all because I just wanted to meet someone, you know, was that the women that I met, it was very conventional. Actually, that was what was surprising about it. Was that for the most part, people just wanted to meet someone and fall in love, and for women that were in their late 30s, almost all of them wanted to have children and children soon, and were very upfront about it. Like quite often, and often on a first date, someone would find a reason at some point in the conversation, even though it's like the first hour of meeting someone, to try and address the issue of whether having another child is a possibility, and sometimes I used to find it a bit much, but it was kind of a very common thing, and I think that, some of those different women that I met in ways informed Laura, and I remember one woman I went on a few dates with used to have these spectacular rants about Facebook, some of which even formed some of the stuff in the play. She just used to talk about how depressed she used to get looking at her friends putting up pictures with their kids, and there was her childless. So, I think both the characters, I suppose the characters come from experience rather than autobiography in a narrow sense. That's the thing that's important.
But you mentioned that whole dating game, it's not a game, and dating has always struck me as being a ridiculously lightweight kind of word for what's really psychologically quite traumatic experiences. But also so much is vested in it, isn't it? It's almost an audition, and people are trying to figure out whether there's a future. I mean, that's pretty big stakes. And you said Danny actually says at one point that he was put off online dating partly because he came across a large number of women who were at that age where they were specifically looking for a partner to have a family with, and he was uncomfortable with that kind of pressure. Which brings me to that you mentioned earlier, one of the spoilers, everybody, one of the key moments in the play is that Laura says straight out to Danny that she's ovulating. And when she states this, the stakes are certainly raised a bit higher as to what's going on between them. And I wondered, when you put that in there, did you have any hesitation that, as a male writer, you might be leaving yourselves open to the charge that you're appropriating the cliche of the single woman who's desperate to have a child, her biological clock is ticking?
No, but I just explained to you. I mean, it was my experience, to me. It was just my experience. Was if my experience of dating had been women who just wanted to hook up and go and see exhibitions, then I would have written that. But my experience wasn't that. My experience over and over and over, actually, so that you couldn't deny it, was that. And actually, it was that. In a way, it was, I suppose, in some senses, that conservatism that surprised me. That while apps and websites facilitated all sorts of different kinds of relationship and hookup, actually, what I found the women that I met wanted again and again and again was something actually quite old-fashioned. And I think, the playwright David Edgar has always said that a playwright has to bring back news from the streets. And what he's saying there is you have to write the world as you find it, not how you wish it to be.
Yes. And that's what you found.
Yeah, and also, I knew from, well, not just from my own experience, but from female friends of mine, that having had kind of years and years of safe sex in their 20s and 30s, that suddenly that when at a different point of their life, the kind of contraception suddenly becomes a bit less important. And that was something that I was really surprised by as well. But also, that truth was then reinforced by talking to female friends. I mean, there's one in particular, an actress and a writer who'd very much wanted to meet someone and have a kid and all of that. And, she was quite open about the fact that if she liked someone and she happened to get pregnant, it didn't matter very much that she didn't know them that well, because life was moving on and, she was either going to try and have a kid or not. But her view was, that if she ended up raising a kid on her own, then that was what she ended up doing.
Yes. So, I mean, it's true. The many desires and demands of forging a fulfilling life for a woman in our modern world, the desire or opportunity to have children, is a very common and profound challenge to many people as to what stage of life this is going to happen. Hadley Freeman, I think, in the program for the play at the National Theatre wrote something. Female freedom will always come up against the non-negotiable roadblock of female biology, and women's concerns about their fertility should not be shamed.
No, absolutely not. I don't know, what it comes back to is I just think that as a writer, I'm very much a writer who's always tried to write the world as I find it. There are some writers who are more interested in writing the world as they would like it, do you know what I mean, or as they imagine it differently. But I'm not so much in that camp. I tend to be someone who writes what they find. I don't know, I feel very defensive of women that I know that are my age, and including my partner, that somehow that they should be branded cliches in a way for wanting those things. But anyway, it just always will come back with me to writing what you find, and you have to stick to your guns and write all of the complication in that.
Well, there's no doubt there's a truth, David, in these characters and their hopes and desires and how desperately they feel them. I mean, Laura, you talked about that speech she made where she describes the sort of ideal life, but she also described the background to her life, which has led her to this strength of feeling about family, about her own mother and father. Her mother died when I think she was about 20, and her father then sort of drank himself to death. Yet she has no family left, and she feels like her life's a shell of activity, and everybody envies her independent female life, but she's miserable because she basically hasn't got the closeness or the happiness that comes from a family. And I mean, there's this heartbreaking moment where she describes the flat she's acquired relatively recently, and she's shown around it by a young couple who are selling it to her, who have a 10-month-old baby. And she says at some point that she asked them if she could have a cuddle with their baby. I mean, I found that really heartbreaking.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is. I had a strong sense with Danny and Laura that there were two people whose lives weren't as they would like them to be.
Exactly.
And were unsure if they were going to be able to move forwards. And I think what happens at the beginning of the play is kind of Laura, they've met each other and there's something that's clicked there. But Laura's kind of braver in a way and is prepared to go for it a bit. And Danny maybe is a bit more damaged and hurt.
Yes.
Doesn't quite have the confidence to begin with.
He definitely doesn't.
But I mean, as you were sort of referring, I mean, this part of the conversation is all making the play sound quite mournful. But actually, I mean, it was always important to me, as I said elsewhere, that the play is funny. I always think that one of the best things about Chekhov and why he's maybe the greatest writer for me, maybe even greater than Shakespeare, is that Chekhov is able to sound the note of humour and desperation simultaneously.
Yes.
And I don't know that I can always do that, but I certainly believe in making an audience laugh as well as cry. I think that the full spectrum of human experience is really important. And even in the bleakest of situations, it's a very human thing to laugh about it in some way.
Yes. I mean, the embarrassment of Danny through this is one of the exquisite things of the play. And it's a sequence of embarrassments in a way. David, one of my favorite moments in the theater in many years was watching the dance scene in your play. Danny put some music on in the room, again perhaps as a diversion, or maybe even to create some mood music to help him move on. The tune he chooses is Lady Hear Me Tonight by Mojo, I think, which is a sort of modern dance classic. He then begins to sort of dance to himself, but initially he's not fully committed to the dance. He's a bit self-conscious, and it's just sort of the beginning of a kind of dad dance movement. But something in him catches. The music grabs him, and he instinctively seems to understand that if he commits to this dance, it may lead him to overcome his paralysis and to break through, to take the romantic initiative or something. It is both excruciatingly funny and mesmerizing to watch because, as you've just said, it's true. It's him wrestling with himself still somehow in physical form. So I think you achieved what you're describing. Actually, it happens when things he says as well, but this is a sort of one of those pure moments when the drama is happening in action right in front of you, and yet it's expressing everything that's inside him as well.
Well, I think that's really interesting because I think that probably that area of the play was the bit of the play that kind of shifted the most in rehearsal, or in inverted commas, was rewritten a bit in rehearsal, because I think I envisaged much less dancing.
Okay.
But what became really clear as we started to rehearse the play was that unless Danny tried to dance a bit more, that it was hard to retain sympathy for him.
Yeah.
So you don't want the audience to think, oh, come on, you've put some music on, now you're not dancing, you fucking knob. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so what I realised was that there had to be a bit more action, and that it was much better if he kind of committed to the first dance when it was a song that he liked.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, he didn't choose that song, by the way. I mean, it's quite, because it's just the playlist on shuffle. It comes up, but you know, just by chance, it's a song that he likes and he is happy to talk about and dance a bit. But when it's a song that she likes,
yeah,
that he's not interested so much in dancing to that, and that was much better because Danny retained your sympathy. And when the Bros came on, you could still have an element of going, why aren't you dancing? Now it's her song.
Well, I think it goes back to what you said earlier. The second half of all this is that, again, that expresses something about what's going on between them, and that there's still a bit of a gap because he doesn't like that song in the same way, and he doesn't know how to come together, and she sees this.
Yeah.
She's basically saying, well, you better go home.
Yeah.
So actually, this kind of failure to somehow gel and like the same thing demonstrates how far apart they are at that point. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they kind of, I think that section was really brilliantly directed and choreographed, because in terms of the physical comedy in the first half of the play, that's all really authored by me. That wasn't stuff that was written in after rehearsal. The section to do with the dancing, that was where I indicated least, and so we as a company had to decide what the story was we wanted to tell there.
Well, the first parts you're talking about, when you mentioned earlier about that sort of comedy of awkwardness and embarrassment, that's the classic British style. You know, it's a bit like The Office or something like that, isn't it? In that tradition, what you were writing, which is almost excruciating to watch on behalf of Danny. And what is it about embarrassment that is so powerful? Why are we so hung up about that we could become embarrassed if we do take a chance and do act in some way? Or
I don't know. I mean, I think it elicits empathy, doesn't it, from an audience? You know, when you watch characters that are caught in an embarrassing situation. I mean, to sort of squirm as an audience is to sort of deeply identify with the characters, because you think yourself of what it's like to feel so embarrassed and awkward, you know. So I think really it's about empathy, and that's why you're able to cringe or laugh or want to hide or whatever your response to it is.
You're right. It touches something really deep inside us, from universal in some way, that fear of getting something wrong or not belonging, and we've all done it, obviously.
Yeah.
So it is useful, and we do recognize that. We were talking earlier about the way the play unfolds in terms of how real it is and true these characters are, and how they share what's happening in their lives and what they feel about it. So it's kind of like, it struck me that it's a sort of slow reveal that in real time even, we discover, as they discover about each other, what's been on in their lives and why they are where they are and the way they feel the way they do. As in Danny's lack of self-confidence, or Laura's unhappiness, or both of their unhappinesses. Where does it come from? And we learn this sort of in a quiet way, that, you know, heartbreaking details, I think, David, that you let out really beautifully. And Danny, for example, that point you mentioned earlier about the man you knew who hadn't seen his daughters. This is Danny. He's got a Facebook profile pictures of him and his daughter.
Yeah.
But his daughter's only 3 in the picture, and he's already told us that she's 7.
Yeah.
Why has he got a 4-year-old picture? Because, of course, he isn't seeing her, which is heartbreaking. And he lives now, obviously he's separated or divorced, and lives back in his own bedroom in his mother's house, where he grew up with all the kids' paraphernalia still around him on the walls. He's 42 years old. And he has there's a toy box in the room, even a detail like that, where instead of his own toys, he's got toys of his daughters, but they're 4 years out of date. I mean, all these little things are just heartbreaking as they build up a picture of why Danny is the way he is. You realize that deep down, this lack of self-confidence is so profound because he's been so hurt by what's happened to him. And he feels guilt and shame and is unable, therefore, to take the risk of more hurt. That's what it is, isn't it?
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. You describe it very accurately. I understand it. I mean, I think when anyone, it's a knock to anyone to suffer the end of a marriage. I mean, I had a bit of a different response to Danny in a sense, in that I found the stuff to do with my son very painful, but I thought it was right that my marriage had ended. And also I knew that I didn't want to be lonely or miserable, and I wanted to get on with my life a bit when I could. But I had an old school friend who split up from his wife around the same time I split up from mine. And he's someone I used to see occasionally at West Ham because we had season tickets near each other. So he was someone I sort of was only really in touch with on Facebook, and then I suddenly started to see more regularly just because of where he was sitting at the football. And then when he split up from his wife, he sort of got in touch with me a bit because he thought I might be going through a similar thing. But he had a very different response to me. He couldn't go out on a date. That was like the worst thing possible for him. And he was very close to his dad. And he liked to kind of go football with his dad. And he liked to have a drink on a Saturday. And he liked to go to work, and maybe have a beer after work on a Thursday.
Was he happy with that, or did he just not?
I don't think he was, but I think that gave him a sense of security. And what it crucially meant was that there was nothing scary in that for him. There was a sense of security, and certainly the idea of having to start to risk his heart again. He was a kind of million miles away from that. So that was something that was very present for me as well when I was writing the play, that not everyone had the response that I did to that situation. That lots of people, were very, like I said, the man who hadn't seen his daughters, my old school friend. These things tend to come together in the making of a story, and then a character in a story for me.
Well, I think however you slice it, it's not an easy situation, and we all respond differently, and we all are different characters, but it requires courage, I think. And actually, Laura says as much, doesn't she? At some point, she says, let me see, Laura says, "I've put my heart in my hand, and I've shown you it. I've been brave. How brave are you?" She throws the gauntlet, in a sense. Yeah. It's a challenge. We understand this is not easy, but are you to take a risk? Because if you don't, then nothing can happen.
Yeah.
I mean, Laura describes that her idea about the future and everything, but she also says that she can't guarantee that Danny will be part of whatever future. If, for example, they happen to create a baby, it's a big if. And as we've said, they are both desperate to create a family potentially, and Danny is desperate to be part of a family. But Laura's not able to guarantee that's what will happen. So Danny says, so he realizes it's a punt, he says.
Yeah.
To which Laura replies, or maybe the beginning of something, which brings us full circle possibly to the beginning and the ending. What is beginning? Why is this play called Beginning, David?
Well, I think for the reason you just explained. And it's to do with what we talked about, with the audience wondering at the end what it's been the beginning of. That's what the play asks the audience to do in one sense, which is, having had the pleasure of the experience of being with them for an hour and 40 minutes, and their ups and downs and the funny bits and the sad bits and the cringy bits, and that they do manage to find the courage to come together and kiss and go to bed on the sofa. The play definitely asks you to wonder what happens next. So I think that's the point of the title. What is it the beginning of? And it can only be a question because the play is just the play. It asks you to consider what happens next. So what is this the beginning of? Anything or something or nothing?
Yeah, because as you say, We don't know what it'll be. It could be any number of things. It might even be the beginning as a new life is literally created.
Yeah.
She has said, she's ovulating. Is a new life actually going to be created? Will they create a happy family life together? Will they be happy? Is this a long-term relationship? Is this a one-night stand? What is beginning? And in fact, Laura said at some point, when has anyone ever got it on with anyone and it's not felt crazy? It's all a leap of faith.
Yeah.
We don't know where we're going with this next step. But I think the act of courage and doing it itself is important. It seems to me it's about their self-esteem in some way as well. That to act is better than not to. I've often tried to say myself that avoiding something you fear does not remove fear.
No, that's right.
You can't overcome a problem by hiding from it, so you need to act. It's easy to say, and actually, if you take that step, it's rarely ever as bad as you think it will be, but you just feel better for doing something.
Yeah.
And therefore, that's sort of what's beginning here, I think, for them, is that they're taking that risk and doing something.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, I'd also say that one of the reasons why you stay with Danny over the course of the play rather than disregarding him is because I think that although you realise that he's a bit scared and that he's not got confidence, that he never leaves. And that means that the audience, I think, always understand that he's trying to find the courage to do it. It's just it takes him a while to get there. And I think that they're going to find the courage to do things. And that is something that really informs beginning and the action of beginning. I think they're slightly different because I think Danny's just trying to find the courage to reciprocate, and Laura is trying to find the courage to be honest about what she wants and who she is. Danny doesn't have that much trouble in one sense being honest about who he is. In a way, they become some of the obstacles, don't they?
Yes, because he's self-deprecating to a fault, isn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like a protection mechanism of his to say, I'm shit at all this, so I'm not going to try. And she spots it. She calls him out on it at some point. She says, you're putting obstacles in your way by just downing yourself all the time.
But I think it's true what you say. The finding courage, it's very sensitive what you say, is such an important part of the play and the characters and who they are and why as an audience we stay with them.
Definitely, because also I think with Danny, as well, with both of them, but with Danny you feel on the surface you've got this presentation of potentially an Essex lad, right? He's especially in the early part of the play. There's some great stuff you do, David, with the language he speaks, which is sort of full of male cliche, that it sounds false in his mouth anyway, because he's sort of just aping what mates do, and that it doesn't ring true. And that the important part of that is that the more you learn about Danny, the more you respect him. Deep down, he has integrity, and as Laura says, he's a good person. He's a good man, and she can tell that. So he says some things about his expectation about how to behave with women, for example, like he only fucks girls he wants to be with. It's not just someone who's, thinks, oh yeah, here I've got a conquest, whatever, I'll shag this woman who's offering herself. He's actually more sensitive than that. And he also says that, he talks about being honest. He's honest to a fault, as we've said. Don't not say what you're thinking. So even though he's full of this hesitation and a lack of confidence, underneath he's got integrity, which I think we see more of, and respect as the play goes on, and therefore we care about him as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true.
I'm conscious that we've been rolling on in time here, David. Thank you so much for everything. This has been a real privilege, and I know we could go on for much longer. Before we bring the curtain down, however, there's one more thing I'd like to ask of you, which is that one of the fixtures of our podcast is we take the opportunity to ask our knowledgeable guest to recommend a play that we might talk about in an episode of the podcast in the future. So I know this is a bit hard because there's so many of them for you, but is there a personal favorite among you that you could share?
No, it's easy. I would strongly recommend the playwright Robert Holman, who is both has been as a good friend, a mentor, and an inspiration to me throughout my life. And his play Across Ochre, which I think is a wonderful play. I think it's the only play, still after all these years, that's ever moved me to tears from just the read. And also it's a play that made me gasp out loud just from the read. I think it's a really wonderful play. And I think that it's a play that's come back into focus. Actually, it was when it was first done at the end of the 80s at the Royal Shakespeare Company. It was a great success for them. You know, it was a really great metaphor for the kind of fragility of relations between East and West at the end of the Cold War. And I think probably that didn't feel, for obvious reasons, quite so present, that theme, for a while. But in the last decade or so, it feels again very, very important, particularly given that the president of Russia is evoking so much the kind of Soviet era in this nationalistic spirit that he's got.
But there's nothing new in these political cycles of world history. That's a great one. I'm going to search it out because I don't know it. That's a great suggestion, David. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today and for beginning.
That's all right. You're welcome.
The ending of our play today is, of course, just the beginning. The beauty of the title and the ending of the play is that it's open-ended, as we've said. We do not know what is to come for these two characters. You leave us imagining a whole range of possible futures for them beyond the play. Even if the odds may be low that it all turns out perfectly, we certainly care about them, and we feel some hope. Hope because they have been brave, taking a step forward to try to change their lives. We believe that at the very least, they will begin to feel better about themselves, whatever unfolds. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.